Welcome to page 86 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. Continuing our conversation about the peripheral nervous system and the distribution of spinal nerves. So we've talked about the afferent and efferent nerves coming in and out of the spinal cord, but where do they go and where do they come from? And we're going to start to explore that now. So the spinal nerves, as you know, is that short little section of nerves. We talked about, let's see, the spinal cord. Let's say you have the posterior root here. Or maybe that's the anterior root, and then we'll have the posterior root down here. Talked about how nerves come in the posterior root for sensation, and then other nerves or neurons leave the anterior root for motor function. And then they join up together in this place here as the spinal nerve. They join up this little section right here. Let's see if I know how to draw. There we go. It's a little better. This little section that they pass through together before they go branching off is called the spinal nerve. So we're talking about the spinal nerve now. So at each level of the spine, a spinal nerve exits. The drawing is very small here. So the spinal nerve would be, say, here and here. Very difficult to see in here and here and here and here. The spinal cord, of course, runs right down here. So these are the nerves coming off of the spinal cord. They're called spinal nerves. But they're only called a spinal nerve for this little section right here, during this little section. And when they branch off, they're given a new name. So let's continue to draw the spinal nerves coming off. A little section of spinal nerve. Go. And then a spinal nerves coming off of the sacrum, sacral spinal nerves. Okay, so that little section right here is what we've just diagrammed. A little section of the spinal nerves. And now we're going to talk a bit more about where do they go after that? What happens to them after they pass through the spinal nerve? Where do these neurons go? Well, after they leave the spinal cord and branch off from the spinal nerve, multiple nerves will come in conjunction with each other, and then branch off again after that. These areas that this occurs are called plexuses or plexi. This is a plexus. It's sort of adjoining. It's like a train station. It's where different signals can pass through different nerves. Different neurons can pass through different nerves. So a neuron from here might pass through here and go to that one, whereas another neuron from this nerve here might pass through and go to this nerve over here. And yet another might pass through this nerve and go to that nerve. So it's a way for neurons to come together, join, and switch tracks, so to speak, as though they were switching tracks like a train at a train station. And because each has a different destination, destination A, destination B, destination C, whereas they all came from, let's say, origin A, they can now branch off to multiple different places. And of course, same here. Origin B, well, this one now comes through this plexus here and might wind up at C. And then another from B might wind up at B. Another from, might wind up at A. And it's a way to transfer signals and get to the signals from this limited place here in the spine to all of the varied places of the body. That nerve signal might need to go to many different places. And this is how it happens, through plexuses, or as you could call them, plexi. There are 8 cervical nerves. Cervical means neck. It's the area of the neck. There are, let's see, hopefully I got it right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's about right, yes. 8 cervical nerves. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves because there is a nerve above this first vertebra here. This is C1. There's a nerve above and below C1. Let's define that here. Here's the vertebra C1 right here. Here's the second vertebra C2, the third C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. Now watch the nerves. Here's the first cervical nerve, the second cervical nerve, the third in between 3 and 4, the fourth, between 4 and 5. So one above C1, between C1 and C2, there's another one, between C3 and C4, or 2 and 3, and then between C3 and C4, and then between C4 and C5, and then one between C5 and C6, and one between C6 and C7, and then one between C7 and actually T1, it's called. But count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are, as in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but there are 8 cervical nerves because there is one nerve on top of C1 and one nerve below C7. That makes 8. Now the first plexus that's formed is called the cervical plexus. It's the nerves from C1 to C4. The first 4 cervical nerves form the cervical plexus. And this isn't the greatest drawing here, but you can see how the C1 nerve, 2, maybe 3, and 4 can kind of join up into a little plexus right here called the cervical plexus. So this is the first plexus of the body where nerves are joining us. Not very well defined here but you can see it very well defined in your book. The cervical plexus. And then the next plexus is called the brachial plexus. Brachia means arm. So where do you think this plexus is going to go off to? Where do you think these nerves are going to supply? The brachial plexus, so they're going to supply your arm. Where do you think these cervical plexus nerves supply? Well, the cervical spine, the head, and they turn back around and they supply the muscles and skin of the neck, of the head and neck. But the brachial plexus is made of the C5 to T1 nerves. The C1 through C4, that C stands for cervical. Cervical. C1, CC, okay? And the fifth, C5 is the 5th nerve. So you can see in your book describes it better than the screen here, but you can see how the nerve from C5 starts to branch out here and creating a plexus here. There's C5, and I'll do something clever here. I'll bring C6 in, C6 nerve, right? And then there's C7, and my count might be off here. And then C8. You can see how now these spinal nerves are gathering together to form a plexus. and that's called the brachial plexus. And these will go to the arm. What will they do to the arm? They will send motor signals outward, telling your muscles what to do, and they will send sensory signals back in. Back into the plexus. So the brachial plexus and the cervical plexus contain both afferent and efferent neurons. Neurons that are motor and sensory. They make your muscles move and they help you feel things. We'll get more into the brachial plexus in future lessons. Now, the thoracic nerves in the thoracic spine, this is called the thorax here, this area here, called the thorax. Your chest area is called the thorax. So it makes sense that the nerves coming out of it would be called the thoracic nerves. I believe, let's see, this is T1, the first, 2, T3, there are 12 of them. I think we're behind, I think there's one up here. T1, T2, T3, T4, 5, T6, T7, T8, T9, 10, T11, T12. 12 thoracic nerves. Those are the thoracic spinal nerves. That little section of nerve right there popping out. And what do they become? Well, they become the intercostal nerves. Costal means rib. Next time you see costal, you should think rib. Thoracic, think chest. So these nerves, they are your intercostal nerves. And they wrap around your chest in between. They run in between your ribs, the nerve. If you ever have one of these pinched, it's not fun. Intercostal neuritis. So all the way down these, through the rib cage. And what they do is they innervate the thoracic muscles, the muscles in between your ribs, the muscles that help you breathe. Okay? And they also supply sensory information for the skin. So they provide information coming out to the muscles here in between your ribs, telling them to breathe. So that's motor. But they also give information to coming inward to your spine from the skin that gives us sensory information of the skin around your thorax and tell you pain receptors and sensory receptors. So again, they are afferent and efferent nerves in the thoracic spine. And there are 12 of them. Now, one for each vertebra. So there are 12 thoracic vertebrae and 12 thoracic nerves. Count those vertebrae. Vertebra 1, vertebra 2, vertebra 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 12 thoracic vertebrae and 12 nerves to go with it. The interesting thing about the cervical spine is there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 cervical nerves. I told you because that one extra nerve on top here. Or you could say the one extra nerve on the bottom. Now, the lumbar spine, there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. 5 lumbar vertebrae. Number 1 here, number 2, 3, number 4, and number 5. And there are 5 corresponding nerves that exit between the lumbar vertebrae. The vertebrae, of course, are the bones, the segments, the bones of the back. And they also form a plexus, a lumbar plexus. L1 to L4. After these little spinal nerves leave, watch, they form a plexus. They can kind of come together and form a plexus before they go off and do the things they need to do at the places they need to do them. And you can see, and of course, where do you think they'll go? Where do you think the lumbar plexus will go? What will it innervate? The arms up here? No. The lumbar plexus nerves of the lumbar plexus will go to innervate and supply and receive information from and give information to the legs, the muscles, skin, arteries, glands of the leg. And that's the nerves from L1 to L4, forming the lumbar plexus. Now, there's another plexus in the low back called the lumbosacral trunk. And you can see it takes from L4 and L5. Here's the L4 nerve, spinal nerve, extending out and then joining L5. The nerves from L5 to L and L4 and S1, the sacral nerve, the first sacral nerve, will join together and form this nerve we've all heard of before called the sciatic nerve. You know, when this nerve gets pinched right about here or in any place along its path, it's called sciatica. The pain that results is called sciatica because it's a pain in the leg. And these nerves also innervate the leg, same as the L1 to L4 nerves. And when they innervate the leg and there's any pressure on them, on this nerve anywhere, the pain is going to feel like it's in the leg. Even though the pressure on the nerve is here, signals coming and going are disruptive, and the brain perceives that the pain is coming from down here in the leg when it's really under pressure here on the nerve. And there's a sacral plexus too, where some of the sacral nerves join up. There are nerves coming out of the sacrum, segment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sacrum is fused. These segments up here are all mobile. They move. They're separated. Each segment is unique. But we still call these sacral segments, even though they're fused, we still call them segments. And they each have a nerve. And there's little holes that come out of the sacrum where the nerves pass through to supply some of your muscles of your perineum or your some of your pelvic organs and pelvic muscles. That's called the sacral plexus. Taking a closer look at a cross section of the thoracic spine. That is the middle back area and the area with your ribs. So that's what this cross section area is. It's a slice, a transverse cut right at your rib area. And so this would be, say, inside your chest. These would be your lungs would be in here, filling up this space. And this is the back. This is the front of your body. This is the back of your body. This is a vertebra right here. This is the body of the vertebrae. And the spinal cord is right here. So here is the posterior horn of the spinal cord here. Here's the anterior horn right here. And you can see the dorsal root here leaving, the neurons of the dorsal root here on either side. Of course, this big bump is the dorsal root ganglion, right? And then leaving the front, the anterior horn is the anterior root or ventral root, right? And coming up to meet what? And you all know this because we've been talking about it. Where the two meet in this little spot right here. What is this little section? This is the spinal nerve, right? This is where both the anterior root and the posterior root meet up. The sensory The afferent and the efferent nerves meet up. So neurons meet up. So right in here. And they're passed through together before they branch off. And that's what this diagram is really intended to show, is this next area coming up. Well, first of all, the anterior root here, and then the posterior root, these terms. I want to make sure we cover them. And after the spinal nerve, they branch off into two separate branches, one to the posterior, to the back, and one to the anterior, the front. Same nerve, different colors. I just made them different colors to the front side. This is the anterior, this is the front. So when they branch off from the spinal nerve, they have two different names. This is the anterior rami. The rami, that's different. The rami communicantes is different. Some branching go down and up the spine. They're called rami communicantes. But this is the anterior primary rami, or anterior rami. And the one that goes back is the posterior rami, PR. Oh, there it is right here. So the anterior ramus is, or the posterior ramus is in blue here. There you go. And the anterior ramus in green. There we go. The anterior rami become the intercostal nerve. The intercostal nerve, it's that nerve I discussed in the last image there. It goes all the way around and underneath, in between your ribs. This is the intercostal nerve in between your ribs. Okay. So the anterior rami becomes, in the thoracic region, in the chest region, becomes the intercostal nerve. And then it splits into two branches. One that are for the skin, that involves sensation from the skin. Cutaneous means skin. Anytime you see cutaneous, that's a nerve that goes to the skin, or comes from the skin, I should say. And then the so the intercostal nerve, and then the lateral cutaneous, and the posterior primary ramus branches off here to innervate the muscles. You can see it in the skin of the back. So yeah, and you can see these nerves from the cutaneous. You can see from the anterior primary rami, from the intercostal nerve, branching out to innervate the skin. This is your skin right here of your side. Let's say you raise your arm. This is the skin of your side. And this lateral cutaneous branch of the anterior ramus, or the intercostal nerve here. And then the branching off here, the anterior cutaneous nerve. So let's say somebody pokes you with a pin right here. That receptor, their signal will be received by the lateral cutaneous branch right here. Lateral cutaneous branch. Somebody pokes you with a pin, that signal will come. That signal will come lightning fast in through the lateral cutaneous branch of the intercostal nerve, lightning fast into the dorsal root, through the spinal nerve to the dorsal root ganglion, to the dorsal ramus, or to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And that sensation will be perceived by your brain all the way up to the brain, and you'll say, ouch. Let's say somebody pokes you right here. Same thing, except it's going to come back this way through the intercostal nerve, etc., to the spinal nerve, dorsal root, to the dorsal horn. let's say if somebody pokes you right here, well, that information, that painful signal will travel inward through the posterior ramus into the dorsal horn, from the dorsal root ganglion, from the dorsal root and up to the brain. So we're highlighting the paths of the nerves after they leave the spinal cord and after they depart from being just part of the spinal nerve. So the posterior ramus back here has a medial branch and a lateral branch, and it's tough to see in the diagram, but it's J and K right here. So a branch from the posterior ramus, the medial branch, and the lateral branch. So interesting to see how the split that occurs. Here's the spinal nerve right here. I'm going to use a different color, brown. Here's the spinal nerve right here. Remember the split, the posterior ramus and the anterior ramus. It's just interesting to see the paths they take. You know, if somebody pokes you a pin right here, it'd be interesting to know whether the signal would come, you know, through the intercostal nerve, the anterior ramus, then the intercostal nerve, and then around here, would the signal come from this nerve, or would it come in from this nerve right here, this lateral cutaneous branch of the posterior ramus? You see, so it's just interesting, really unique. We're just really fun to see the diagram out the nervous system and show it's got it all covered. So little nerves would come off to the skin right here, right? Sort of detect that pressure from the pin. And here in this final diagram, we are presented with a nerve. What is the detail? What does a nerve look like? I don't think we've covered this. We've talked a lot about neurons, axons of neuron. That's a neuron right there. Here's another neuron, and here's another neuron. The nerve cells. And the nerve cells have coverings. They're wrapped in coverings. So we've talked about some of these words. Epi means above or on the outside of. Endo means inside of, and then peri means around, kind of wrapped around. So the epineurium, as you might guess then, if that means outside of or above, it's this outer covering. That's the epineurium, covering a nerve, covering a bundle of nerve. This is a nerve, yes. The perineurium would be this wrapping of a bundle of those nerves, right? And then the endoneurium would be the individual wrapping around an individual neuron, separating them all. So very similar to muscle fibers, if you recall, the epimysium, endomysium, etc. And that small nerves are bundled into bundles of nerves, which are bundled again into bundles of neurons, which are bundled again. And these bundles upon bundles of neurons we call a nerve. So a nerve is made up of many tiny little neurons. And these epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium are the coverings of the nerves, protect them. This concludes our lesson on the distribution of spinal nerves. I'm Dr. Stephen Harkins. Until the next lesson.